Thank you so much for being with us today. A very warm welcome to our gathering Sustaining Resilience, Land Rights and Politics of Conservation. My name is Canan Batur. I can see a lot of familiar faces today, which is brilliant, but for those who haven't been part of our program, I'm the curator of live programs here at Nottingham Contemporary. Hope you've been enjoying the spring so far, and thank you for choosing to be with us on this very warm and sunny day. We really appreciate it. So I'm just going to read my notes very briefly. I hope you don't mind. Today we welcome three brilliant practitioners, Marwa, Arsanios, Youngsook, Choi, our presenters, and our fantastic moderator, Khanyisile Mbongwa, to delve into the relationship between conservation and land rights, highlighting different modes of relating to land and the urgency of centering reparative approaches. I will keep my notes on our event very brief, and I will soon hand it over to Khanyisile to introduce the panel further. In terms of the running order of today's event, we will have offerings from Marwa and Youngsook. Each will be touching upon their relationship with research and practice on in and through land. The presentations will be followed by a quick conversation with Khanyisile, and after a short break, we'll convene again, and then we'll open the floor so you can pose your questions, comments, dreams, desires, whatever you would like to share with us. Some very brief introduction to our live program and housekeeping notes before I introduce today's guest, hence the reason why I'm holding this laptop right now. Our live programs open up different interventions and propositions within our curatorial research across the organization, and this event expands on our current research strand, emergency and emergence. A multi-platformed program that looks into transdisciplinary, sensorial, and speculative practices of radical sense-making and wayfinding, remediation, and maturation to investigate how to move from crisis to renewal, from emergency to emergence. This event is also a collaboration between Primary Nottingham and artist-led visual arts organization in Nottingham that I'm sure some of you already know very well. They prioritize creative research, provide studios and development for artists, and run a free public program of exhibitions and events. And also with the Mosaic Rooms, they are celebrating their 15th year this year, and they devise a year-long program that interrogates active solidarity, support structures, and alternative models of self-organization and collaboration. Although we will keep a very informal atmosphere throughout the day, please be mindful of each other's opinions and respect and perspectives so that we can have like a kind of very informal session where we respect each other's opinions and views. So please feel free to come in and go as you please during the conversations. As I said, we really want to keep it informal. So if you want to, grab some food, grab some tea, please feel free to do so. In an unlikely case of emergency, a member of our staff will guide you to the nearest fire exit. And I would like to use this opportunity to extend my thanks to our funders, but also my colleagues, Philippa Douglas, Jim Brower, for making this event possible. Lastly, with all the events here at Nottingham Contemporary, our events are free, so if you feel generous, please do consider donation. I hope you don't mind reading the bios of our presenters now before I hand it over to Khanyisile. Our moderator, Khanyisile, is a Cape Town-based independent curator, award-winning artist, and sociologist who engages with her curatorial practice as curing and care, thus using a creative creation to investigate spaces for emancipatory practices, joy, and play. Mbongwa is the curator of Puncture Points, founding member and curator of 20 Journey, and former executive director of Handspring Trust Puppets. She is one of the founding members of arts collective Googlective, Vasiki Creative Citizens, and VOC Poetry Collective Writers in Session. She was the chief curator of the Stellenbosch Triennale 2020 and is the curator of Liverpool Biennial 2023. I'm also very delighted to welcome our presenter, Marwa and Youngsook. Marwa's practice tackles structural and infrastructural questions using different devices, forms, and strategies, from architectural spaces, their transformation and adaptability throughout conflict, to artist-run spaces and temporary conventions between feminist communes and cooperatives, The practice tends to make space within and parallel to existing art structures, allowing experimentation with different kind of politics. Film becomes another form and a space for connecting struggles in the way images refer to other images. In the past 4 years, Arsanios has been attempting to think these questions from a new materialist and a historical materialist perspective through different feminist movements that are struggling for their land. She tries to look at questions of property, law, economy, and ecology from specific plots of land. The main protagonists become these lands and the people who work them. Her research includes many disciplines and is deployed in numerous collective methodologies and collaborative projects. Youngsook is a London-based artist researcher. Her performance and installations explore the concept of political spirituality by experimenting with intimate aesthetics of solidarity, actions, and collective healing. More recently, grief has been the focus of Youngsook's practice, posing collective grief as a process of sociopolitical autopsy around certain types of death. Not this feature, commemorating the Essex 39 tragedy, and in every bite of the emperor, the ongoing ecological grief project are in tandem with this inquiry. Youngsook is also a co-founder of a research practice working group, the Colonizing Botany. So without further ado, Khanyisile, I hand it over to you. And many thanks again for joining our conversation today and our also community, so thank you.
Thokozani, ndingumbongo ugadula umbuyisa unyamazana kamthimkhulu, ndingukhumala umuntu ungumbulasi wadla umuntu emyengandaba, ndingumadonto umthembu umelasi uqhude nothukela umnquhe, ndingumabaso abasentabeni kwadliwa ilanga selishona, camakoshisa ujola, camakoshisa umbathane, camakoshisa utshatshu, ndingusithole, ndingumthanti, ndingumtshali, ndinguhlophe, thokozani. My name is Khanyisile Mbongwa. Before I say anything, I introduce and acknowledge my ancestors. I am because they have been. And so I enter every space and acknowledge their presence, that they've carried me to this very moment, and acknowledge the other ancestral presences in the space, particularly when we are having to speak about such charged topics. We welcome you all and are grateful you have made space to share your time with us as we engage with sustaining resilience, land rights, and the politics of conservation. I mean, what a charged title. When you think about being called into a space of having to sustain our resilience, in a way transcend our lived experience, as we experience continued extractions in the aftermath of colonial and enslavement projects, and the continued institutional, systemic, socio-racial, socio-political, socio-economic, and socio-cultural oppression. How do we speak of land rights and the politics of conservation as we are fighting for our right to exist, our right to be alive as Black, brown, indigenous, and ancient and queer beings? So when I received this invitation and started listening to Marwa and Youngsook's work, I thought about some of the phrases I heard growing up, such as the land of milk and honey, the promised land, the motherland. All of them make me think of belonging. Where's home? How do we get there? When the borders don't permit, can we enter? In 1913, the Land Act in South Africa legislated the dispossession of land, which had already begun with Dutch settler colonialism. It further entrenched land segregation by prohibiting Black people from buying and occupying 93% of the land. The remaining 7% was demarcated as native reserves for the majority of the population. This is the same year Adelaide Tansi Dube published her poem titled Africa, My Native Land, that reads, "How beautiful are thy hills and thy dales. I love thy very atmosphere, so sweet. Thy trees adorn the landscapes rough and steep. No other country in the whole world could with thee compare. It is here where our noble ancestors experienced joy of dear ones and of home, where great and glorious kingdoms rose and fell, where blood was shed to save thee. thou dearest land ever known. But alas, their efforts were all in vain, for today others claim thee as their own. No longer can their offspring cherish thee, no land to call their own, but outcasts in their own country. Despair of thee I never, never will. Struggle I must for freedom, God's greatest gift, till every drop of blood within my veins shall dry upon my troubled bones, O thou dearest native land. So I share this to contextualize myself and my curatorial practice, founded on two pillars of care. Care meaning, how do I care for the artist as maker, as person, and their narratives? And cure, how do I instigate a space within the institutions I work with that allow the artist's work to do the work it intends to do without having to negotiate the politics of the institution? What technical processes do I need to set in place to hold the work? This is built on ancestral foundation in the form of indigenous knowledge, wisdom that foregrounds ancestral and forensic listening and mapping, that counters that being African, being Black, being queer can only be read through generational trauma and violence. It locates me on a timeline that unkeeps the colonial, that unkeeps the enslavement, that unkeeps the apartheid violence, thus aligning me to the spiritual blueprints of my ancestors that they left behind as indigenous wisdom. Further, it echoes the words Tokwasa Dyson once shared with me. This is not my violence. Why should I keep it? Why should I repeat it? And so today's presentation by Marwa and Youngsook invites us to think about what remains, what survived the extractive violences, what and how the land remembers. And as Janan communicated earlier, if the content of the works shared today trigger you, please take a moment, step out and breathe and enter again when you feel grounded. But we hope that we can co-create a space that ignites you to align, to land in a generative way. Please, I welcome Marwa. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this beautiful introduction, Khanyisile. And thanks to Janan, Rebecca, and Zikron for organizing this. And yeah, I look forward to your presentation as well, Youngsook, and to the conversation we will have. Yeah, I'm going to talk about a long-term project or something that I have been engaged with for the past maybe 5-6 years. And this started with actually a trash crisis. So it started in a moment in 2015 when there was a trash crisis in Beirut, my hometown, where I used to live and also co-run a kind of an artistic project, artistic research project, and also a project space. Was called 98 Weeks. There was, back in 2015, a catastrophic situation where trash was all over the city. And this was due, of course, to an accumulation of years of mismanagement, of kind of political corruption, what have you, like a situation of total collapse. And we were observing how this trash was also dealt with. So instead of resolving the situation, and as expected, the trash was used as material to extend land or reclaim land on the coast of Beirut. So it was used as one of the materials together with, rubble, concrete, what have you, to reclaim land. And this land is actually very valuable land because it's a land on the coast. And this is when a group of different feminist organizations came together and formed the feminist bloc, or what they called back then the feminist bloc, that participated in many protests and different activities against this catastrophic trash situation. 98 Weeks, the project space and artist research project that I was part of, took part in the feminist bloc, was participating in some kind of organizing within this feminist bloc. And together with the different organizations, we started to think about ways of responding to that, first of all. And also, second, we needed kind of a knowledge or already present or like already used experiences and practices that came from ecological feminists, or even going back to theories of ecofeminism. And we tried to, dig into that. And in fact, one of the, many, inspiring movements and people that we met and came across was the members, or like a few members of the Kurdish Autonomous Women's Movement. And back then, we invited them as 98 Weeks, we invited them to Beirut. We invited two members, Dilar Dirik and Meral Shishek, to come and talk about the experience and experiment that was happening in the north of Syria, in Rojava, and more particularly to talk about the ecological and feminist paradigm of the movement, of the Autonomous Women's Movement. And they decided to translate a text by a guerrilla fighter, Pelchin Tolidan, who's also a writer and one of the ideologues of the autonomous movement. And for me, this was like a shifting moment, and the very important learning moment that I think, triggered or initiated this whole search and the long detour that took me to very different places, also working and collaborating with different communes and cooperatives to learn from them, to learn from their strategies, and to kind of also almost like to bring this learning back home. And this happened in 2022, where we, in the image you see here, and what I will be talking about later, we tried to bring all these learnings and this knowledge back home in some ways. So this is just to give you an idea of what I will be talking about. And I will start by talking about this convention of women farmers and ecological feminists that I co-organized in 2019 during the Warsaw Biennial. And in fact, that was also like a extremely important moment, because 15 women that are part of different cooperatives and communes and movements came together in order to exchange knowledge and practices around communalization of land and deprivatization of land. So some women from Grupo Semillas, or who work with Grupo Semillas in the south of Tolima in Colombia, call themselves seed guardians, and they are recuperating land through planting of seeds. And in fact, it is very much an idea that is against preservation, let's say, and against the idea of conservation, against accumulation of seed, but rather through like a reclaiming of certain territory, plots of land, by planting the seeds and then letting the seeds reproduce. And that's the way to preserve these Creole seeds. And also there was a cooperative, from Chiapas, from Mexico, that worked very closely with the Zapatista women from the Kurdish Autonomous Women's Movement, and other cooperatives from Lebanon, from like Poland, Germany, etc. And the purpose was to really exchange knowledge and practices about questions of deprivatization of land. They were all working in different ways towards that. I'm not going to go into the details now, but in a bit I will. But what is really interesting about these approaches to communalization and deprivatization is that they're not all legal. And they are, they are not like a kind of a communalization that goes through the judiciary system or the legal apparatus. Because of course the legal apparatus itself is, or laws themselves are protecting the landowners and protecting private property. What they're doing is either, like for example, in the case of the Kurdish Autonomous Women's Movement, it's really an armed struggle, and it's really a fight to reappropriate land through arm. And in fact, I was very much thinking of the way this, of course, like there is a lot of political circumstances and conditions that helped this happen. For example, in the north of Syria, the 2011 revolution and the pushback by the regime, by the Syrian regime, allowed the, like the northern part, that is a majority Kurdish part, allowed it to basically be in this political vacuum. And that political vacuum actually helped, or was like the condition for kind of a installation and implementation of a new way of governance that is perhaps, like many of you know about it or have heard about it, but very briefly, that is a bottom-up system of governance. And that is quite interesting because in that case, for example, the Autonomous Women's Movement got to manage many, plots of lands, agricultural lands, that were distributed to women-only communes and women-only cooperatives. Of course, in this particular case, the legal is completely pushed aside. But communes are built, agricultural cooperatives are built, there's an alternative system that is put in place, and in fact, it just works as such without any kind of a reference, or like a reference to the legal apparatus. That is, of course, in the hands of the Syrian regime. So it was really important also to, take into consideration how these, let's call them like this, utopian ideas could be translated and adapted in different situations. So in the particular situation of the north of Syria, of course, it is the fact that there has been like a 2011 Syrian revolution that allowed for such a fast recuperation of land and the redistribution, as well as this particular system of gender equality. Of course, there was a lot of exchange of these ideas and a thinking of how these ideas could travel and be translated and be adapted in, different localities where there is actually a functioning legal system and there is a state that is, kind of like managing the land, basically. And of course, in the case, as I said, of Colombia or Grupo Semillas in particular, Grupo Semillas is an organization in Bogota that works with different, different farmers and different organizations in the south of Tolima and in Norte del Cauca. And in fact, the seed guarding itself is, or like the role of the seed guardians as the guardians also of the territory and also as the guardians of the struggle as well, because all of this is interlinked, is like and the support of Grupo Semillas, like this organization in Bogota, to the different seed guardians is the strategy. And as I said, it is a question of replanting the seeds and letting it reproduce. It is completely against an idea of preservation that, goes with an accumulation or a kind of accumulation of wealth, and especially also goes against big corporations that want to own the seeds and have them, have a patent on them, or have them as intellectual property to then resell them to the farmers, etc. And yeah, you can see here we had some infographics about the different topics that we were discussing, and the different kind of strategies from, as you can see, the revolutionary armed struggle to agroecological and more agricultural strategies. There is a lot of grief, and this is to also connect to the next presentation by Youngsook. There is a lot of grief in this struggle. There is a lot of pain, and there is a lot of death as well. And perhaps this is something important to acknowledge, because there is, of course, a grief on human lives, but there is a grief on also the land itself and everything else that it carries, the biosphere, the fauna, the flora, etc. But at the same time, there is also a an urgency and a desire and necessity to transmit a very intimate knowledge of the land. And the armed struggle is in this purpose at the end of the day. It is also taking up arms in order to be able to transmit a certain knowledge, to transmit also a kind of ancestral inherited knowledge. And in the writings of Pelchin Tolhidan, there is a lot of, she talks a lot about the intersection of struggles, of course, like the intersection of the feminist and land struggle, and the, a impossibility of separating struggles. So talking about the ecological struggle as something that is inherent to the feminist struggle, inherent to class struggle, inherent to race struggle. So I think that going also against a neoliberal separation of struggles or a neoliberal compartmentalization of struggle is one of the impetus of for example, in the case of Pelchin, of also her ideas about what ecological struggle is. And I guess like when we think about ecology and when we think about like this, these different struggles that are happening through the land and for the land as well, we start to think about like the relations, and we start to think about the relations of struggles as well. And there is a kind of an ecology of struggles, and an ecology that is not only in relation to the ecological in terms of like the environment, but ecology as in a wider sense, ecology as something that builds or that is like a set of relations between struggles themselves, between the human and the land, between the different species, between the different living and non-living, or often the rocks are considered as non-life, which is very also debatable, and this is maybe something that we can, talk about, but between like the different entities and species that inhabit a certain territory, a certain land. And I guess that this was like very important, something that is very important to learn from Pelchin, the ecology of struggle itself, as well as the ecology that is inhabited by the guerrilla fighters. And that, the knowledge of that ecology and that environment that is inhabited by the guerrilla fighter is a very intimate knowledge. Because you live within the mountains. You hide in the mountains. So it becomes, of course, on the one hand, a military knowledge, but on the other hand, a very intimate knowledge of the fauna, the flora, the biosphere, etc. And the fight becomes a fight for a transmission, for the right to inherit all this knowledge and all this ecology as well, all these relations. So I think that maybe this is something we can think about, but as I was saying, in terms of like the pain that comes also with the struggle and the grief that comes with the struggle, what I also learned from Pelchin and from her writings, as well as from talking to her, is that the struggle is something that is, of course, something that is obviously historical, in the sense that the dead, or like the people that are buried, or what is buried under the soil in these mountains, is also part of the struggle. This is something that is a kind of the question of the historicity of struggle that is important. And of course, this is, not something new or anything. I mean, it's something that is, as I said, quite obvious, but it is not at the same time. Because also, I mean, going back to my hometown, Beirut, and where I myself grew up, and in the 90s became a little bit more politically conscious and aware. I grew up in a place, or in a kind of a economy, let's say, that was very much trying to compartmentalize struggles, or this is how politics was understood. You had like the feminist chop on one side, the, children's right on the other, etc. So you had like a kind of a web of NGOs that each became responsible for a so-called struggle. And this is what we call a kind of an NGOification of struggle. And I'm saying that because maybe for me also this, growing up in this kind of an economy, it was important for me to understand, to come out of this economy of struggles, let's call it this way, and start to understand things in a much more relational way. Yeah, in a much more, much more historic way, or go back to this kind of a understanding. I show you here an image from Ginoir, which is the women-only village that is built on a reappropriated land in the north of Syria, Rojava, and where I also spent some time. And Ginoir is kind of a separationist, let's say, or separatist commune, and a women-only commune. And it's an example of an implementation of what, of Pelchin's writing, if you like, which is, like a living, or a kind of a attempt or an experiment to live communally and together with the, on this reappropriated land, together with other women, but also to form a kind of a, like a way of living that is, self-sufficient. And this is like in a moment where there was a, of course, like many threats coming from different sides. So it was important to also understand how these ideas are implemented, and the relationship between the writings, the kind of a thought that is, put into the processes of trying to form ideas or ideologies of like a ecology, or like the intersection of ecology and feminism, and how these are implemented. This is an image of the plan, or like a part of the plan of Ginoir. And so, I guess like in maybe like the example of the women's village or the Pelchin's writing, there is a lot of, as I said, questions of translation, transmission through an armed struggle. In working with Grupo Semillas in Bogota, I found out that the question of reproduction, the question of kind of a maintenance, the question of the maintenance of the land, the reproduction of the seeds is the, as I said, like the main strategy, but also like the name of guarding. So like guarding or being the guardian of the seed, which is also being the guardian of the land. And this also takes us back to a kind of a another form of, it's almost like guarding without weapons, but the weapon is something that is, this little entity, this small entity that is the seed. And that is a threat. It is a threat to corporations. It is a threat to the state. It is a threat to the paramilitaries. It is a threat to, like all kinds of different like bigger, let's say, colonial extractivist entities, but the state itself that is, of course, part of that. Often, like, we think that post-colonial states or, like a kind of post-colonial, in a post-colonial moment, states or like these new states or like new countries are not, we're not anymore, part of a kind of like extractivist mechanism, but they are at the center of it. They are like the brokers of this. They became in a neo-colonial system. They are really the broker and the facilitator to these extractions and exploitations. So again, like going to this idea of, so just like to keep some maybe like keywords or concepts and, like harvest them along the way. So from translation, transmission, armed struggle, and then, going to this, like reproduction, replanting, reproducing, and guarding. That's an image from Norte del Cauca. And another strategy, or another, also from Lebanon and from a women's co-op in the Bekaa Valley. Another strategy is also foraging and archiving. So foraging, archiving, and then, in order to, like in the purpose of food that is, in their case, they are doing all these workshops with Syrian women that are living in neighboring camps to teach them how to eat for free, basically. So how to forage what they find around them, and how to use these herbs also medically. So also for food and medically as well. So again, the understanding or archiving in order to understand what is edible in your surrounding, how you can eat it, how you can use it for medicinal purposes as well, or medical purposes. And then I arrived to Beirut. So this was like a long detour back home. So started with the garbage crisis, if you like, in 2015, and then went on a long detour journey, and then came back to the north of Lebanon, where there is this quarry, as you can see here in the image. That together with a lawyer, an agricultural cooperative, and a historian, as well as families that are living around the co-op, what is to become a co-op, but the quarry. We were thinking of the rehabilitation of the land, but also how to transform it from private property to a common. And in fact, we went back to an Ottoman law, an existing Ottoman law, that is still active because 25% of the land is still common, which is like beyond ownership, which is neither public nor private. So it's impossible to own it. And there is still, this land still exists, the status legally still exists, and every village still owns its common, has its own common. There is a way, an acknowledged collective way of using it, and some villages also share commons. And in fact, there is a gap in the law that would permit us to transform a land from a private property to a common. And so we have been trying to do that through a negotiation with the owners And in fact, it's a plot of land it's different plots of land. It's not very big, but it's different plots of land. And the owners cannot use it in, any kind of, it needs a lot of work to rehabilitate it, and it's not very valuable land. So people are not really, very attached to it. In terms of like financial, let's say, attachment, or in terms of like a property. So what we've been trying to do is, as I said, going back to an Ottoman law of or like an Ottoman inherited Ottoman law that would then allow us to transform it into a common. So this is in process. We have started the rehabilitation of the land. We have found a way to rehabilitate it. Maybe before I continue, I would like to show you an excerpt of the film that I did around the quarry. And this will also bring in another question, that is my position as an artist in relation to all of that. And maybe this is something that we will discuss more later. So I will show you an excerpt from the film, Who's Afraid of Ideology, Part 4, Reverse Shot. And then, I will just say a few words and wrap up.
Let's imagine a land that wishes to separate from the private property regime. It flies off demanding to be in a non-ownership status, or beyond ownership. It is a separatist land. It has been quarried for 50 years. Its soil is compacted and full of small pebbles and rubble. Now it demands separation from a property regime that has imprisoned it for more than 100 years.
هون في تراب. تربة رملية. هلا هونيك مرصوصة وما عم تقطع المي، يعني المفروض تكون طينية. هون عاطي رمل، يعني في عنا معلومة يعني بدنا نجرب نفهمها. رح ياخد شوي من هون شوي من هونيك، خلطهم مع بعضهم تيعطيني قديه تكويني.
واحد يعني بدك تاخد بين هون وهونيك.
انت شو رايك؟
ايه بدنا ناخد فكرة عامة يعني.
اوكي، فينا نكتب عليه سامبل 1 1419.
We want to turn this land from a private property to a mashaya, a common, so that the users won't have an ownership status over it, only the right of usership.
Why are you focusing on the legal status? It can just be leased for many years ahead. It would be the same.
It will still be a property, and we would like it to become a non-property.
For this, you can look at the Ottoman Land Code. But what will that legal shift change?
We will secure its status as a land that can only be used by people who do not own a land.
In a way, I understand what you are trying to do. Non-ownership can drastically change the relationship to land, especially if the land is used collectively. And yes, the notion of ownership needs to be rethought radically. But to tell you the truth, it is a condition of our times. We can aspire to a world where there will be a withering away of private property. But I think that there is a certain gap between the egalitarian imagination of abolishing private property and our world.
But we can call for abolition in order to reimagine the common.
Sure, but in this process of communization, in this quest for the common, and if we really aspire to a concrete accomplishment of our action, we would first have to rethink all this vocabulary, all this root. Commune, communards, in reference to an insurrectional situation, communication, communism, communion.
But let's look at it from another perspective. Imagine that the land itself demands separation.
Let's not fetishize land.
It is not fetishizing, it is imagining.
It's fetishizing through imagination.
Matter has a memory of the moment when it was not owned, and this was not such a long time ago.
وقتها بس بيعرفوا ايش عندهم عقارات. كان وقتها ما كانش في تنظيم عقاري مزبوط. التنظيم العقاري اجى على ايام الفرنساويه وقت اللي كان في انتداب فرنساوي يعني. مزبوط عم تقولي، بس كانوا يعرفوا، كانوا يحددوا كل عقار، يعرفوا يحددوه. هلا ما كانش في سجلات عقاريه مزبوط، بس كانوا يحددوا كل عقار، يعرفوا كيف بده، والاهل الضيعه كلهم كل واحد يعرف وين ملكيته. مش انه
قسموا العقارات.
ايمتى تقسموا مع الايام يا بي. يجوا هيدا عقار هون فلان وهيدا هالورثه كانت مقسمه. هاي كانوا مقسمين، مش مقسمين يعني بين، مقسمين بالعقود يلي هذا، وبالاستعمال كمان. وقت الواحد يكون عم بيستعمل الارض ووضع يده عليها، كانت هيدي اهم اشاره للملكيه.
Okay, so going back to that question of property and the attempt to bring forward a relationship of usership instead of a relationship of ownership, and going back to a moment where not such a long time ago, actually, like 150 years ago or something, when there was a relationship, actually, there wasn't, or ownership was understood as usership. So whoever was working the land would benefit from the land. And of course, was the French Mandate, and after 1920, the private property regime was institutionalized. So there is still in the collective imagination an understanding, or at least a vivid memory of that relationship of usership. And what we have been trying to do is, bring back, or like at least try to shift a perception of the landscape itself, or the landscape through the imagery as well. Shift the perception from to a possibility of usership, or to a possibility of looking and perceiving this land as not necessarily, like private property. And yeah, I mean, this is maybe a kind of a longer discussion that we can, continue talking about in the conversation. And I guess that, for now, I will leave the floor to Youngsook. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Youngsook. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you everyone who organized and prepared this event. I'm going to share some research findings and thoughts and experiments around my ongoing ecological grief project, In Every Bite of the Emperor. This project tries to witness and weave multiple sites where the colonial and neo-colonial extraction has damaged their ecosystem and the surrounding communities. So where to begin the story of our broken relationship with the land? Recently, I had the privilege to stay with an indigenous community in the Malaysian rainforest. In one conversation, the village shaman told me every inch square of soil holds a different soul. And this conversation was deeply moving spiritual knowledge, as this specific conversation was for discussing the land in North England that persistently refuses to recover. The shaman and the elders assume all the souls in the land moved away due to the violence of industrial extraction. This conversation vividly charted the scale of trauma more than any other scientific data around this land. If every inch square of the soil holds the spirit, how many spirits have we lost? Unlike the shaman and elders in the indigenous communities, colonial operations are all about numbers. Everything and everyone needs to be measured, owned, and extracted. Not only the land and rivers, but also our bodies. Certain bodies from certain geographies. And the time, we lost the time. Think of all the observatories established in colonial times. The arbitrary invention of 0 point. The arbitrary invention of GMT. The erection of 0 point and declaration, the time starts here. The colonial clock, again for measuring where the expedition ships were, and when they would come back with the profitable crops and enslaved labor forces. In that way, we lost time. We gained the clock, but we lost time. Turning the earth into numbers is also about categorizing these other than humans as non-beings and separating them from humans, more precisely white European humans. This separation and hierarchy are fundamental for excessive extraction and unmeasurable violence. In this colonial sense of land and time, every flesh of the ecosystem, including you and me, has been reduced to the fragmentary resources of the system rather than relational beings. Return on investment, only numbers are approvable stories here. When Adrienne Murray Brown says grief is not linear and it is everywhere, it makes so much sense to me, given the loss, displacement, trauma, and emotional pain caused by colonial progression. My practice in recent years has been creating a constellation of grief that is all over in different places, but interconnected. I'm particularly interested in grief as a process of the socio-political autopsy. I propose grief as a site of collective interrogation around reparative tragedy. What are the structural conditions that enable and reinforce certain types of death and trauma again and again and again? Judith Butler observes this. She said, grief is often instrumentalized in enhancing existing socio-political structure that value certain lives above others, implying other lives never get acknowledged and never get grieved. Hence, violence towards them continues and repeats. Ecological violence sits right in the middle of this unequally distributed grievability. But how do we grieve for what we barely understand? Our eco-literacy has long gone through the process of colonial modernization. We don't see their souls like the shaman and the elders in the indigenous communities. I attempt to recover this lost connection by situating ecological grief in the realm of political spirituality. I borrowed this term, political spirituality, from Michel Foucault. He came up with this notion when he witnessed the Iranian uprising in 1979. He concludes that it wasn't the rationalized political argument that successfully organized people. It was actually a religious frame that held people in a strong belief that political change is possible. So see, imagine one of these days, all the people praying 6 times a day at the exact moment with the same political hope. How powerful it could be. Foucault discovered the power of spiritual practice in solidarity building. I found a similar trajectory in Korean shamanism. Anthropologist Jong-woo Kim defines Korean shamanism as a terrain of misfortune. Since the shaman often holds the feast and entertainment to tender the spirit and leads a public interrogation of unresolved death. This ritual often reveals socio-political structures around death, such as the violence of the upper class, patriarchy, and political manipulation. It is not surprising shamanic practice was illegalized on many counts throughout the Korean history, including the Japanese colonial time. Not This Future was my first attempt to situate grief within the frame of political spirituality. This work commemorates the tragic incident of Essex 39. It was about 3 years ago. Probably you remember about this incident. The 39 Vietnamese people were found dead in the back of lorry in Essex. At the time, mainstream media and Home Office quickly wrapped up this incident as the consequence of vile human trafficking and instrumentalized this incident for tightening national border security. But no one really asked why these young people took such a huge risk of financial debt and their lives to cross the border. Most of them are from 2 fishing villages in Ha Tinh province, Vietnam, where tourism and fishing used to be means of livelihood. Then the Formosa disaster happened. Formosa, the multinational steel corporate, they directly disposed the toxic waste into the ocean. Fishing and tourism became impossible. and the area became hotspot of people smuggling. And that's how it happened. But mainstream media never talked about this. The youngest victim was 15 years old. I wanted to organize collective grief as a way of transnational interrogation, since this incident, SX39, reveals so clearly how environmental destruction, neocolonial capitalist operation, and border regimes are closely intricated, interconnected, and form together structural violence. I pulled out 39 offerings from artists, curators, writers, researchers, whose practice and works engage these concerns. And so I gathered at the end the 39 short video offerings. So, in terms of weaving through 39 offerings, Nati's Future consists of 3 parts that engage 3 sequential acts in a shamanistic manner. The first part, Daddy Art. Daddy Art gathers the offerings, focusing on the SX39 incident. It pairs up with cleansing the body of 39 Pollocks with a homemade Vietnamese alcoholic drink. The second part, Everywhere Daddy Art, expands the narratives of extraction and neocolonial violence transnationally. If you see plantation and colonialism as a discourse rather than the West versus global majority, or not kind of non-binary simplistic way, you see a lot of new kids in colonial bloc, including Korea, where I was born and grew up, Japan, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. They're all new kids in the colonial bloc. So the colonial game is getting only stronger and bigger. So the second part, Everywhere Daddy Art, is actually talking about this colonial structure we all live in globally, and the repeating violence and trauma and loss and death around. Third part, Prayer Nati's Future, is for collective witnessing and healing, and it weaves offering that propose coexistence with others and recovering ancestral knowledge. And it paired up with wrapping its fish body with the torn up muslin. So it kind of had this kind of sequential act of dealing with the bodies symbolically. Nati's Future was kind of my entry point, as well as last juncture of the Ecological Grief project that involves research in multiple sites. The constellation starts from Collier's Moss in St. Helens, right next to Liverpool, where I connect with the rainforest in Malaysia, Sampyeong village in South Korea, and 2 fishing villages in Vietnam, of course. And Malaysia is just land of extraction. That's how I found, because it holds amazing geodiversity. It means lots of minerals and valuable stones. And also 6.5 million hectares is covered by palm oil plantation. It's just one after the other, massive scale of extraction. And therefore the rainforest, the Malaysian rainforest is actually older than the Brazilian rainforest, but it's been massively shrinking, especially since British colonial time. And I'm gonna go back to that later. And Sampyeong village is the case where the group of elders had protested for 7 years against the expansion of a nuclear energy plant. And 2 fishing villages in Vietnam obviously related to Nati's Future. So it kind of makes sense to me to close the circle of ecological grief here in Vietnam. So I'm gonna share about Collier's Moss and the recent trip to the rainforest in Malaysia mainly today. Collier's Moss is a land of miracle, almost a miracle. Collier's Moss had gone through a series of extraction. It used to be a clay pit. When we didn't have a plastic or glass or container, everything used to be made in clay. And Collier's Moss used to be clay pit. And then coal mining for decades. and more recently, dumping ground for glass manufacturing. St. Helens is very famous for the glass manufacturing industry. I mean, it's declining, but it's still happening there. So the land, just imagine this land as your body, went through a series of really, the massive extraction. But it is reviving. The earliest the image I was able to find in Google Earth History was 2000. You can see the land is just completely black. And 2022, almost reviving. They're all covered by thick green, apart from that area circled in red. The down part is the lake, so the black down part in black is a lake, but the small black spot circled in red is the area actually refusing to grow. So I call it a dead yard. And when I stand on the patch, I can feel the land is mourning for all the loss. As you can see, the forestry management, they planted the water reed because the water reed is good for kind of purifying and cleansing the soil. But it's not progressing as if there is a fence. And if you go closer on the edge, you can find a lot of dead leaves of water reeds. So it's a very eerie patch of land because nothing can be alive in that patch. And even the sonic environment is very different because there's no sign of life in that patch. And this refusing land and the refusal as a reminder of violent history. So I have a kind of a very ambivalent mind towards this patch. I feel like I really hope this land to recover. At the same time, I hope this land stays as it is, like this, as a reminder, because it has such a strong kind of sensibility and telling how much violence and the trauma this land is holding. But on the other hand, it is deeply touching to witness interspecies solidarity and collaborative effort that is happening in this patch. Silver birch trees keep sending lightweight seeds to establish green habitat, although baby trees fail to survive. If you see in the middle, like in the little branches, these are all baby silver birch trees. They manage to plant, but they just keep failing to survive. Moss is a very important player in this interspecies healing structure. Moss works rigorously, although they're also dying out quite quickly, but they're not giving up. And rabbits are usual visitors too. They keep coming and checking in and leaving their droppings to improve the life cycle of microorganisms in the soil. So they all come together to mourn, grieve, and heal this land together. It's such a beautiful kind of, witness to this interspecies kind of like a movement. I've been witnessing this patch since November 2021 and mainly focusing on the soil as a medium of ecological grief. I've been experimenting with the scientific method called soil chromatography, which was originally invented for measuring soil quality, therefore for extractive agricultural and mining operations. I am subverting this method into spiritual language to narrate the speculative solidarity moments by mixing the soil from traumatic lands with organic healing matters, such as ground moss, rabbit droppings, and leaves from the shaman tree. The most memorable process so far is mixing the soil from Koleos moss with the peel of fruits given by the elders from Korea who had protested against the expansion of the nuclear energy plant. And the result is the right bottom one. So if you compare the two different ones, the one right next to this one, And the one next to it is the one when I mixed with the peach peel. So it kind of creates, the beautiful moment of solidarity visually, like a beautiful speculative moment when the generosity and strength of these elders embrace tight the land that is refusing to recover. And this is work in progress. So I'm trying to build this disobedient clock with the images of this soul chromatography. As I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of interested in the lost time in exchange of gaining clock. And so this is very much work in progress. Yeah, so this work will be refined with the more kind of elaborated interspecies healing narratives I shared before. And alongside this, producing this disobedient clock, I'm also preparing to create the community grief ritual for this land. In St. Helens, where the cosmos is based, there is a stark contrast between ecological recovery and social decline. While nature is rigorously bouncing back, human communities are ever so crippling. Like as if most post-industrial towns, post-mining communities struggle from everyday socioeconomic deprivation, often manifested in violence. The community ritual approaches environmental destruction as an intersectional issue that needs to build interspecies resilience for both traumatized land and also struggling communities. The ecological grief ritual making process will involve a group of domestic violence survivors. The group of women who holds the lived experience of patriarchal violence and understand what trauma means will be strong companions to sit with this refusing land. Honoring the motto of St. Helens, Ex Terra Lucem, roughly translating light coming from the earth, the ritual will engage the light and clay as core medium of loss and collective healing. The second juncture is the rainforest in Malaysia, where the world's largest tin mining production during the British colonial era destroyed a large portion of the rainforest and displaced indigenous communities. I just came back 2 days ago from a research trip in Malaysia, so I should warn you what I'm sharing now is not fully digested yet. It's still hot and raw in here and here. So this trip focused mainly two things. One is to witness the traumatized land and the structure or pattern of extraction. The other is to learn the living knowledge and the healing practices of the Semai tribe with one of the indigenous communities. And I'm just drawing this kind of curious story, how tin mining started in 1848. It's just, I mean, I have a lot of stories engaging on elephant, but that's another mountain of story that needs another time. So the Perak region along the Kinta River has a very peculiar geography. I would call it consequential geography. And before the trip, when I checked the map, I thought, wow, the this geography is really interesting. It must be really beautiful with a lot of lakes around. But it turned out they are the consequence of tin mining. Basically, tin mining needs a lot of digging the earth. And all these lakes are the result of tin mining. And its consequence of geography, also grieving geography. The consequence of gravel pumping and massive scale of destruction by tin dredging machines engineered by the British. What I found interesting in this trip also is that tourism is a closing circle of extraction. When you look at the pattern of extraction, the end is always tourism. That's what I found. This one is the last remaining tin dredge facility, the floating machine. And now this is the tourist attraction. TT5 is tourist attraction. Sorry, doesn't like my presentation. It just shut down. So this site doesn't mention anything about ecological consequence of tin mining business, and also doesn't mention anything about displacement indigenous communities. It only mentions about engineering advancement and also the kind of national pride there, because they're now exporting this knowledge to other countries in vicinity. On the other hand, these lakes are, if you just drive through, these lakes are really beautiful. It's filled with water, and you can spot at least 3 different types of herons. It means there is a possibility of different ecosystem. Before, I had a really depressing conversation with the tour guide in TT5, because that TT5 is full of birds. So if you go inside, the sonic environment is just mesmerizing, because they installed the recording of the actual dredging machine. So it has like a really violent, like a digging, ding, 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 ding sound. And along with it, there's a like really chatty bird sound. And so I found it really interesting, and I had a conversation with this tour guide, and this tour guide told me, yeah, it's a really problem. These bird droppings are rotting the machine. We need to find a way to get rid of them. So it kind of, the conversation sums up how we relate ourselves to the land and other beings, and how tourism can never be the answer of conserving, preserving anything. So after tin mining, another form of massive extraction is quartz mining. That site is so traumatic to share with you, but the area is just full of these heavy machines if you just drive through. And again, same rhetoric and same narrative, but it can end in tourism, because the rocky structure of limestone and quartz actually quite beautiful. So some sites turn into tourist attraction. But initially, I became interested in rainforest in Malaysia because of the Semai and Temia tribes' healing practice and their relationship to the ecosystem, especially their dream practice. The way they map out their ecology is through the songs they receive in the dream. So that dream defines the name and the story and the relationship. So if you have a fruit tree right next to your house, your dream will tell you what's the name of this fruit tree and the story of your nurturing, tendering, and also the relationship. And in fact, fruit tree is their way of documenting family genealogy. Who planted fruit tree defines the genealogy of the family, of the community. So it's a very different knowledge system. And also the criticality of this dream practice is their homological knowledge system. In their world knowledge, there is no divide or categories of human, non-human, or different species. There's only spiritual category: head spirit, heart spirit, and root spirit. And in that sense, when the head spirit mixes with the different heart, the head soul mixes with different heart souls, or different body and different spirit, and becomes trouble, or it becomes a sacred message. So that's how their knowledge system works. So that was kind of my initial interest, to understand how they relate themselves to the land, and also how they become land, and that the land becomes them. So I had the privilege to observe their healing ritual called Sewang, and it takes whole day. It starts from climbing in the morning to find the sacred leaves and fragrant flowers to form the centerpiece to invite the spirit to the ritual. And it's just whole community endeavor. And also this Sewang ritual shows someone's illness is apparently community affair. So they all come around and prepare together for healing ritual. So I'm gonna wrap up by sharing this extract from the prologue I wrote for this project, long-term ongoing project in Every Bite of Emperor. It was originally delivered in a form of performative reading for Covent Pioneer in 2021. And I'm gonna share this part of it to kind of sum up the thoughts and ideas around this ecological grief. Sound.
God, angels, humans, animals, plants, minerals. God, angels, humans, animals, plants, minerals. God, angels, humans, animals, plants, minerals. The great chain of being in this medieval order of the world. Everything descends from God. Carl Linnaeus, a revered botanical scientist, spent his whole life refining the taxonomic system for nature. First, he removed the spiritual sphere from the world of science. Without God, without angels, the hierarchy of his science kingdom descends from a very specific human variety. Europaeus albus, white European, along with subracial species of red Americana, tawny Asiana, and black Africana. The white European became the equation to God. Since then, the world has had to follow their order and serve them. In 1872 Japan, the Meiji Emperor ingested meat in public as part of the New Year's celebration. Proposing the West as the cultural superior, Westernization was accelerated in the Meiji era, including the ambition of transforming Asian bodies into Western ones. This transformation wasn't just about cutting hair short and changing into the Victorian attires, but also about everyday diet. Meat-centered Western food consumption was declared as a national benefit. In times, meat eating was a social taboo. It was a forceful institutional gesture. I imagine myself as one of the spectators, quietly witnessing my emperor chewing the red meat and dismissing 900 years old social taboo. I foresee the forests are getting wiped out, the slaughtering of trees and floras and species inhabiting them. In every bite of the emperor, I feel the blood filling up in my mouth, the taste of westernization, the taste of great empire. I feel sick. When you become a widow, you see widows everywhere. When you lament, the ghost becomes no longer a stranger. Every loss directs us to all other worlds coexisting. They are beyond our eyes, beyond the Latin alphabets. History might select a few, but the story needs all of us. The story not from your head, but your belly. The field was full of bright yellow spots, a calling from dandelions. I imagined a bitter salad, tea, and liquor containing mineral goodness. I imagined my hands touching the wet soil, tightly cuddling around the dandelion roots. I thought of my mother. She always managed to forage something, regardless of the season, whenever we go to the mountain together. I started digging up the harvest of few dandelions. But soon, a man with angst approached me. "Excuse me, I'm the keeper of this garden. What are you doing here?" "I'm just harvesting a few dandelions." The man started raising his voice. "Can you not see you are irritating the landscape? There was nothing here before I came. I secured the funding and have been working hard to create and protect this ecosystem. And now you are destroying it." I was frightened and quickly hid my dirty hands and dandelions behind my back. "Sorry, I didn't know." At that moment, it wasn't just the scolding man who upset me. The whole situation must have been comic to these dandelions, as I heard them laughing and giggling and saying, "Who protects whom? Did he just say nothing was here before he came?" I wished it wasn't just me who could hear the dandelion voices. I wish that the man could understand the land he is standing on is beyond his capacity of protection or destruction, and certainly beyond the funding schemes for conservation. In 2014, the elders of Sampyeongri, a small farming village in Korea, gathered around their shaman tree. The purpose of this gathering is to call for protesting against the government plan to install the high-pressure transmission towers across their spiritual land. 2 towers were scheduled to be built in this village, one in the Noin mountain, where the community rituals are often held, and the other just behind this shaman tree. The construction for the first tower launched already with a series of explosions that upset the spiritual mountain. A few days later, the village suffered from the excessive amount of hail. It damaged all the orchards and onion fields. In that year, farmers' income declined to almost zero. The elders see it as a curse. Without funded scientific research and all those complicated numbers, the elders just know this is the result of ecological disruption and humans' arrogance and exploitation towards nature. The villagers are asking the mountain for forgiveness and praying to the tree for protection from further destructive progression. Clearly, our elders' trust is not on the state authority, but on their ancestral tree and mountain who came to this world before them. The grandmothers recognized the importance of forming interspecies solidarity, calling not only humans, but also all spirits of nature. Anna Singh, in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, says that gathering becomes happening when the self starts getting contaminated by the others, the indeterminate moment of self and other transformation. The elders were trying to shape their transformative moment by blurring not only self and other, but also humans and non-humans, the material and the spiritual.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I need to be. Thank you, Youngsook, and thank you, Marwa. I'm just going to do a quick response as the respondent slash, what am I call it? Moderator. I always take responses seriously because it's a way to thank the people who have put together the information and like the time you've spent researching and moving through these narratives to make way, moving through the catastrophe to make way for us to be able to trace the catastrophe and trace possible ways of healing, not only ourselves, but the land beneath our feet. So there's an Aboriginal saying that we do not own the land owns us, which always reminds me that we are custodians. In my culture of the Nguni Nation, we speak of Ubuntu, which became a global popular term post-94 as part of Utatu Mandela and Tatu Desmond Tutu's Rainbow Nation in South Africa. Ubuntu, which is about seeing ourselves as part of the ecosystem. The djembe drum is one example of Ubuntu in practice. We go to the forest and ask permission from the tree. We call for the rain, maine, to feed the earth, to grow vegetation, to feed ourselves and to feed our livestock. We ask the cow to offer itself to feed us, to clothe us, to create the skin for the drum. We gather to sing and dance, our feet fertilizing the ground, giving thanks to the sky, giving thanks to the forest. We are part of the ecosystem. We live in commune, to care, to cure, sharing earth, water, and air. Your work, Marwa and Youngsook, remind me of Ubuntu not appropriated as humanity, because again, humanity means there are other people who are not. They are deprived of human rights, and so Ubuntu can never be humanity, but instead, humanity as our spiritual connection and respect for all living entities. Are we truly listening to the land? This is my question to you. Are we truly listening to the land? Your works question ownership that functions outside of colonial extractions, tracings, mappings. It's a cartographic memory and an inquiry reminding us that working the land is imagining with the land. It is an intimate way to pay attention to its needs and that of our own. It is to build ubuhlobo, a relation, a sacred kinship where secrets are shared between ourselves and the land. You move between colonial terror and ecological consciousness, asking us at every turn, have our ancestors left us blueprints about how we can live with and within and of the land, outside the borders of ownership or private property? The continued extractions and what this means for being suspended in the occurrence, on the reoccurrence, and what are the possible healing pathways, and how we can speculate the relationship between land, ecology, and collective community healing. Again, you call upon us in your generosity and your cartographic tracing of imagining otherwise and how we unpack ecological frameworks that offer us possibility in light of capitalism's persistence. You truly ignite my utopian self to dream of the day capitalism devours itself. It is one of my biggest dreams. We were not meant to survive. This is what you remind me of. We were not meant to survive. I think of Audre Lorde's poem, A Litany of Survival, when they write, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. Or where they write again, for all of us, this instant, this reflect, this triumph, we were never meant to survive. Or when they write again, so it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. And so as you were speaking, this is the line that kept on recurring in my life. We were never meant to survive, but here we are. Here we are. I read these excerpts because your works make me think not only of what survives in the violence, in the violent histories of extraction, but also how knowledge, rituals, customs, traditions survive, and how they call and hold us in the land. You both insist on us to imagine and dream, and that is a language of refusal, a refusal of the violence. Marwa, you speak of the impossibility of separating the struggles of land, economy, race, gender, being through excavating legal landscapes of land. Youngsook, you speak of time as a constellation of grief and using grief as a collective autopsy and transnational interrogation. A refusal. I hope we ignite our grandmother's technology to heal the land beneath our feet. So, thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity. I will start with you, Marwa. So I watched a little bit of your work, trying to sort of prepare myself for this day so that I can sound very smart and informed, but I'm not. I'm an unknowing person, just a curious being. So your video or your films they're like an ecological poem to me of questions, propositions, unpacking, beholding, pondering perspectives, and possibilities of rights, of what rights do we have to be in community with the land. So my first question to you is, what is the world through the land are you trying to imagine and why? Why is this imagination important? How have you considered the shadow of imagination?
Thank you. Thank you for your beautiful words. And yeah, I mean, I wish I have your beautiful language, but I don't. Yeah, I have more like a basic international English. So yeah, I guess like the question of imagination and the question of also what seeps through this imagination and an imagination of a kind of a, let's say, small-scale utopia or a kind of a possibilities or trying to carve some possibilities for imagination. And I feel like everything that I try to look for and also like try to do together with other people is often this kind of like a digging and carving a kind of yeah, like a possibility for or a potential for imagining. And a shift in perception, so trying to look otherwise. So when we're looking at the landscape, as I was saying, we're looking at a landscape that has a potential of not being owned, or we can actually look at it and imagine that actually that land was not divided as such in individual property or in individual plots that are privately owned. I guess like what then seeps into these utopian kind of aspirations is always dystopia. And I guess that we can't really think of utopia without dystopia. I think they are connected and they are they come together. They're inseparable, like, the struggles themselves. That, talking about an ecology of struggle then also brings us to think about any possibility for utopia also comes with the dystopic. And I think that the dystopic seeps through possibility for collectivity, a deprivatization of land, and a non-ownership. It seeps through like histories of women that have not been able to inherit, for example, women that have not been able to survive or had to leave the land and go work in houses, for example, in other people's houses because of not finding another way to survive. So this comes through. This kind of like a story comes through. What comes through as well is a history of and stories of people that have been died from famine because of embargoes during the Ottoman Empire. It's also what comes through is a very violent way of surveying and dividing and distributing the land into plots and privatize them. So there is like all these kind of histories that comes through, and also the potential of this future projection, like this future utopian projection, to turn into dystopia. So this as well. So I guess like there is like a collapse of temporalities, histories comes in, and also the possibility of a future that is, as we imagine it or as we plan it, turning otherwise. And maybe this is the shadow, or like, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking of like a that.
Okay. Speaking of shadows and how you sort of spoke of dystopia, I'm gonna go to Youngsook. Your work, in a way, for me, is like an invitation for us to consider grief in relation to the ecological, to reconcile with these histories of extractions and how they complicate our contemporary existence. And you do this thing of like asking us to listen to both how our bodies feel in the space and time, and what that means for that specific geographical location. I'm very curious about your choice of material and form in making every bite of the emperor. As you know, dealing with grief, because it's a very difficult thing to to grasp.
It is almost dictated by the process, and I was really interested in looking at soil because mainly I became very interested in eco-literacy. We talk a lot about land rights, but how can you gain the right in any genuine term without making relationship? I mean, it's exactly the same way to look at land as a resource. If you don't build relationship and declaring, oh yeah, we're gonna come on this land there, but this is gonna different, ownership or different usership. But it's same. We're still looking at the land as a resource. We're not relating ourselves to them. Therefore, eco-literacy is becoming very important kind of subject of interest. And so the choice of material in a way emerges through the relationship over the the research and sitting with the soil, observing all the little creatures around the soil and land, and And I picked up soul chromatography because I also wanted to kind of twist extractive science into something kind of poetic and artistic language. And also in your kind of in the early reflection you mentioned, are we really listening to the land? I have so much problem with the scientific listening. For example, people start talking, oh yeah, trees are talking to each other. Instantly people start talking about this, but the way they convince is to poking the needles into the tree and, oh look, the chemical substances are changing, which means it proves trees are talking to each other. But indigenous communities has been telling us in last 5,000 years, trees are talking to each other, but we didn't listen to them. But instead we're looking at the chemical numbers and look, we listen to the trees and then we prove trees are talking to us. That's how we build relations. And yeah, so for me, that kind of, the complex relationship to this scientific methodology and methods regarding the ecosystem and understanding how it works, it becomes very much the subject of research, also the medium of subversion.
Okay. Yeah, so I can go into Marwa there because of the way you've put together your presentation, that in a way is like, a lecture, or you submerge us in this sort of ideological framework. And I'm curious about what your intention is, and what do you want us to find in between these images and these conversations?
I think that all through like the Who is Afraid of Ideology project and the different chapters, I've been trying to think about what film can do, or like how to use film in order to also like make these relations between struggles, between different, geographies, but also between like different strategies of deprivatization, communalization. And I think that in the last chapter that you've watched an excerpt from, there is a, let's say, like a more dialogical, scripted and more staged situation where there is like a two, if you like two perspectives that are, dialoguing with each other or like conversing. One is coming from kind of a more, let's say, historical materialist, a bit more orthodox perspective or understanding of property. And the other one is coming from a more kind of a new materialist understanding of relationship or of matter as a thinking entity in itself. And I think that what I've been trying to do in the past like 5 years or so through the Who is Afraid of Ideology research is to try to understand also how to expand the notion of property, or like this, let's say, like a more historical materialist understanding of property, how to expand it with this a new materialist approach that is coming more from a thinking around matter itself. So how this can contaminate a like an understanding of a more traditional understanding of property, or a critique of property. So I think that in part 4, these two voices, or like these two perspectives, are dialoguing with each other, and there is a kind of like a back and forth, and trying to find a way to come out of these to, and maybe this is like a completely failed project, you know, and I don't know. I mean, this is also like my PhD thesis that I've been working on and I have to finish very soon. And maybe like bringing together like these two streams is not because they don't sit together very well, but trying to use this, like new materialist approach to matter, and then therefore to property, and therefore that something that can shift this relationship to land, to soil, etc. So this was a bit the intention. So the thought around property is not stuck in a kind of like a Marxist critique of property. So I think that this was like the intention. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it is an interesting way to sort of enter land and ideas around land and sort of travel with you as you're also sort of negotiating with yourself and like which route to take. Youngsook, you took like the grief route, right? Why grief? What are you trying to hold in the ecology through grief? Where do you desire to point us towards when you say we must enter through grief?
I think it kind of almost started with the sense of urgency when there has been a lot of discussion around the climate crisis. And in parallel, there has been kind of prolific discussion around the technocratic solutions, and therefore, you know, we can integrate this technology, you know, to be more energy efficient, and you know, we can have a, you know, almost the meat tastes like a fake meat, like all this kind of technocratic direction really kind of alarmed me. And how can we, it's also kind of very kind of typical way of modern dealing of the loss. Like you need to be efficient to the colonial capitalist clock. Therefore, when you have a loss, just quickly wrap up and move on and be functioning to be part of the system. Same as climate crisis. We lost 7 glaciers in the last 3 years. We lost lots of, I mean, in terms of colonial interpretation, we lost a huge source of fresh water. And just, you know, I foresee massive scale of, migration due to it. And this is happening, a lot of lost trauma and the broken communities around and emotional pain, anxiety happening, especially ecological anxiety amongst young people. I feel so kind of sympathetic and empathetic with them. But we don't hold the space for making apology or collectively coming along and acknowledging the loss. And what's the point of moving on without having this space? For me, it was like a almost violent progress. Having this kind of, we can live in a very eco-friendly life thanks to these technologies, thanks to, these new systems. And yeah, so it was kind of almost out of this sense of urgency. We need to have this space first. Without having this, without holding space for grieving and full interrogation to look at the socio-political conditioning and the structural violent frame that keeps eroding the planet, including us. I don't know. I don't really see the point of any progressive argument around the climate crisis.
Yeah, ne? Okay. Yeah, I just have to like take a moment there because, my utopian self is like, okay, what do we do now? How do we not drown in the creation of what we've made of, land? Like we are all accomplices in our current condition and circumstance when it comes to climate. So I'm thinking about land like in a more expansive way, like not just like land as property, but land as like territory, like thinking of the ocean, thinking of the mountains, like just thinking of like earth. And this is a question for you both as the last question, so we can take like a 10-minute break afterwards to, you know, like in the work you've been doing, the research you've been doing, you've like, you know, given space and time to thinking about, you know, land as a question, as a space, as an imagination. Do you think, with all the work you've done, do you think we disturb the land with our digging? And digging also being like on a conceptual level, spiritual level, do you think we are disturbing the land in the way we probe and excavate? Do you think we need to ask permission? From whom do we ask permission, and how do we do that?
I prefer the term plantationocene than Anthropocene. Every day I think of, I might live in the plantation still, and in this extractive system. And if we look at you suggested land not as just physical territory. I also see plantation in the same way. Plantation is more of rhetoric and discourse that repeats this extractive system and capitalist machine. And because of that thinking in the back of my mind, almost everyday level, and I don't know, asking permission to hold the land, I don't know, it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think we need to at least acknowledge what system we've been building and enhancing. And I think we can talk about rights a little later. I'm not kind of, dismissing all the kind of the movement around the, alternative ways of running and co-owning the land. But I think, there must be something done before even going to that stage. And in terms of permission, for me, like, because I work with different lands and soil also in it as a physical form, I think of a part of my body that connects to this organic being. And I often think of my hair and nails in that sense, or in the process of permission, because even if we all become grown up, hairs and nails are still growing. For me, it's kind of sacred parts of our body, and it still grows every day, and telling us we are kind of fragile and organic, vulnerable beings, and that's why I often connect my hair to the land and offer my cut nails into the soil. So I think we can think of kind of little way to connect the land. I don't know, it's just very rumbling.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm also not sure how to answer this, but I think that there is like a way to propose, at least, another relationship to the land. And I think that all these different, what so many, communities have been doing is proposing something that, a knowledge, of course, like that is often inherited knowledge from their own, ancestors, or from their own kind of communities. And what they've been doing is really like proposing another relationship to the land. And I think it's really a question of how do you relate? How do you actually, bring into the land and acknowledge the fact that it's giving you back? So I think it's more a kind of a relationship that needs to change. a relationship that needs to be shifted. And all these proposals, what they're doing is really thinking about this relationship, thinking about it as the mountains where as somewhere that is protecting you, where you can hide. Thinking about like like the agricultural land as something that is you are working, you are maintaining, it's giving you back, but how are you maintaining it? How are you working it? And I think this is what needs to be shifted or changed or thought through. And in fact, it's not a process that is it's not going to change like overnight, or it's, I think, many attempts and many different proposals, many experiments sometimes that are not necessarily, that will not actually work out, or that are not the right thing for that place, or and also it's about like finding certain gaps where you can maybe like intervene or do something through these gaps, like through these vacuums, through these like moments where you can like act or do something. I think the grief is an inherent part of these proposals, if you like, or these experiments. If there wasn't grief and if there wasn't loss, there wouldn't have been a thinking of a new relationship. So these relationships are born out of the grief. And I agree, often you need, like time to acknowledge and understand and accept the loss. But also there is often a necessity to understand the loss through through a new relation, through like thinking of a new relation. And I think that, this loss is often processed through this possibility of relating differently and understanding differently the land. And I think this is the place where, there is a movement, there is something that can change, there is like a possibility of something that can change in this relation. And of course, like property itself is a relationship. And so when we think of non-property, we don't think of like a non-relation, but we think more of a relationship that is not, that is not of one of ownership, or like that is not one of possession, that is not one of plotted land that is, divided and then owned with a document, or I guess like it's all these, so it's really in this relationship where things can be shifted and moved, and
Thank you. I hope it's all possible in this capitalist society to imagine a non-ownership. But thank you so much both for your amazing work and really heartfelt, spiritual, ancestral work you're doing in thinking about these very big concepts, ideologically and intellectually, and bringing them into a space where we can feel them. So thank you so much both for your offerings, and thank you for being here. And we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we can come back and I will hand over to you to engage. Thank you.